Here's what they never tell you about Paulie Walnut's disappearance in Season 4, and why the truth is far less glamorous than the rumors. Season 4's curious lack of Paulie Walnuts invites all manner of speculation, most of it far more dramatic than the reality. Viewers searching for a grand behind-the-scenes conspiracy, contract wars, creative exile, shadowy studio vendettas, will be disappointed to learn that the explanation is almost painfully practical. Tony Sirico was recovering from major back surgery. Hard to gin up a Machiavellian plot when the culprit is a lumbar disc. Of course, nothing stirs fascination quite like the suggestion that a man's spine is involved. Any mention of back problems tends to inspire the same hushed reverence usually reserved for ancient curses or malfunctioning spacecraft. Computers can calculate the trajectory of a comet, but deciphering a human vertebra remains, apparently, beyond mortal capacity. Naturally, this gap in medical omniscience leaves room for the colorful mythology that tends to surround Paulie. He is, after all, a relic of the old school, an elder statesman who, in spirit if not in mobility, refuses to explain himself to anyone. Hence the chorus of imagined retorts that would have greeted any intrusive inquiry. The brusque demands to mind one's own business, the culinary insults, the inevitable order to vacate the premises with haste. Meanwhile, the show patched over the absence with an off-screen detour to an Ohio jail, a narrative shrug that functioned as both explanation and placeholder. The character gets a pass. The actor was, quite literally, incapacitated. And for those who still require a more thrilling justification, there is always the theory that Paulie was on a top-secret CIA assignment in Afghanistan. A bold premise. Heroic, clandestine, and impossible to verify. Perfect, really. But the truth, dull as it insists on being, is this. Season 4 lost Paulie for a stretch because Tony Sirico's back demanded a temporary exit, not because the character was infiltrating foreign intelligence operations. Though, between the two, one could argue the latter is more in keeping with his flair for the dramatic. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Adriana. She played the mob's game long before the mob played hers. Adriana La Cerva's storyline remains one of the show's bleakest ironies. The woman who would have gladly given her life for Christopher is rewarded with contempt, cruelty, and an exit so unceremonious it borders on contemptuous. Her final stretch plays like a slow-motion tragedy, squeezed between federal pressure on one side and Christopher's drug-fueled brutality on the other. By the time her fate arrives, the show makes it abundantly clear that affection, loyalty, or sheer likability are meaningless currencies in Tony Soprano's world. Stand against the family, even inadvertently, and the best one can hope for is to disappear without even the dignity of being remembered. And yet, the tragedy is not as straightforward as it appears, because the series excels at the uncomfortable art of making even its most questionable characters sympathetic. Viewers spend years rooting for a narcissistic psychopath, so naturally, the bar for moral judgment becomes negotiable. Adriana benefits from that same dramatic sleight of hand. She is pitiable, yes, but hardly innocent. She knows far more about the criminal enterprise than any other mob wife on screen. She understands exactly where the money comes from, eagerly turns away from murder scenes, and remains fully aware of what getting made entails. The lifestyle is never a mystery. It is a choice made repeatedly, even when presented with the possibility of escape. Her loyalty is similarly compromised. Her endless devotion to Christopher coexists with behavior that is, at best, questionable, such as the habitual phone calls to Vito, a married man already juggling a comare. The desperation is palpable, but loyalty it is not. The more uncomfortable truth is that Adriana is not a doomed angel. She is a young woman drawn to the familiar thrill of danger, much like Carmela before her. The swagger, the humor, the illicit aura, these are precisely the qualities that attracted her. What she never fully calculated was the cost of proximity to actual violence, and certainly not the possibility of becoming a liability simply by association. Even after the danger became explicit, she still managed to help cover up a murder, as though nothing in her circumstances had shifted. Her story is heartbreaking, but it is also the product of choices, reckless ones, repeated often, made in the hope that the worst would never land at her door. In this world, that kind of optimism is practically a death wish, and Adriana ultimately receives the cruelest confirmation imaginable. Play foolish games long enough, and the prizes are never kind. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Sopranos understood narcissism long before the self-help industry pretended it did. The Sopranos inadvertently accomplished what countless pop psychology books have attempted with far more fanfare and far less accuracy. It delivered a masterclass in narcissism before the term became a household accessory. The series captures the disorder with such unnerving precision, one could be forgiven for suspecting the writers had set up surveillance in the average viewer's living room. Most screen portrayals of narcissists lean on the usual caricatures, glossy supervillains or conveniently mean antagonists whose wickedness arrives pre-labeled. The Sopranos, to its credit, declines those shortcuts. Instead, it presents the full ecosystem: the theatrical tyrants, the middling manipulators, and the covertly corrosive figures who hide malice behind domestic normalcy. The show refuses to restrict narcissism to criminals or masterminds. It exposes it in subtler corners, where the signs are minute, the harm is chronic, and the facade is relentlessly polished. The characters themselves form a sort of taxonomy. The grandiose or greater narcissists appear in their purest forms. Livia Soprano's performance remains a near textbook depiction. Ralph Cifaretto, Richie Aprile, Phil Leotardo, Christopher Moltisanti, Vito Spatafore, and indeed the bulk of the mob's inner circle embody various shades of predatory self-absorption. The mid-range contingent features Tony Soprano, perpetually oscillating between self-pity and entitlement, alongside Janice Soprano, Uncle Junior, and Gloria Trillo, whose placement arguably edges toward the higher end of the spectrum. Then come the covert types, the ones who weaponize vulnerability and propriety with surgical finesse. Carmela Soprano and AJ deliver some of the show's most quietly insidious moments. What makes these portrayals striking is not simply their accuracy, but their prescience. The writers achieved this long before narcissism became the internet's favorite diagnosis. Their work resonates with anyone familiar with the disorder's real-world toll: the black hole negativity, the emotional hostage-taking, the desperate clinging paired with relentless sabotage, the way entire households reorganize themselves around one person's refusal to improve. Given this depth, the occasional debate is inevitable, such as whether Vito belongs on the narcissist roster. But within a narrative where self-interest is practically a professional requirement, that question almost feels rhetorical. In the end, The Sopranos succeeds not because it set out to teach psychology, but because it understood people, especially the ones who make life feel like an endless negotiation with a void. Its brilliance lies in showing that villains do not always twirl mustaches. Sometimes they simply set the emotional weather and call it love. The real ending of The Sopranos didn't happen in Season 6. It happened in Season 3, and no one noticed. The conclusion of Season 3 contains so much foreshadowing that it functions less like an episode and more like a dry run for the show's actual ending. Nearly every thematic thread that tightens around Tony in the final moments of the series is first knotted here, quietly, confidently, and with the kind of unsubtle subtlety the show excels at. Focus on the good times and other family misquotes. The car ride home from Jackie Jr.'s burial offers the first echo of the series finale. Meadow repeats the famous "focus on the good times" line, botching the attribution in the process. Carmela corrects her, but the real joke is that the finale later reveals even Tony can't remember he originally said it. The show practically underlines how little these characters understand the wisdom they love to repeat, and how much they rely on nostalgia as a shield. Meanwhile, Meadow reveals the contradictory morality that later ushers her straight into defending men like her father. She identifies Jackie Jr.'s parents as culpable, yet still pins responsibility on Jackie for having been allowed to do whatever he wants. It's an elegant preview of her future, morally conflicted, but ultimately tolerant of the system that shaped her. The moment Tony loses Paulie, and why that matters. The episode also quietly engineers Tony's political downfall. His choice to side with Ralphie during the sit-down signals the first serious fracture with Paulie. It's the moment Paulie begins drifting into New York's orbit, an alliance that pays off grimly by the finale. Even without the later interviews hinting that the original ending involved Tony driving into New York before everything cuts to black, the seeds are all planted here. Tony backs Ralphie, the show's closest thing to a grinning devil, and Paulie wanders straight into the arms of Johnny Sack. Meadows break from Tony, right on schedule. The symbolic losses continue. Meadows' bread-throwing scene might look trivial, but the framing tells another story. She's positioned on Tony's right side, hurling pieces that miss repeatedly. A visual metaphor the show rarely resists. When Tony finally notices, he chases her across the street, where she nearly gets hit by a car. The finale later stages her awkward parking fiasco with the same anxious energy. Both moments underline the same point. Tony loses her long before he realizes she's slipping away. Ajay as Jackie Jr., the show's least subtle parallel. The episode practically begs the viewer to compare AJ to Jackie Jr., and then obliges with a quiet, devastating moment. Tony and Carmela wordlessly pulling AJ close as they discuss how no one cared about Jackie Jr. after his father died. The implication requires no interpretive gymnastics. The tragedy of Jackie Jr. is a warning about AJ's path, one Tony can see, but never meaningfully divert. And while everything is collapsing, Adriana meets Danielle. As if the episode weren't busy enough forecasting doom, it also introduces Adriana to Danielle from Whippany, the undercover agent who ultimately engineers her downfall. Even the subplot threads its needle toward later catastrophe. The first fade to black. The episode closes with a slow fade to black, a polite early warning compared to the finale's abrupt nothingness. Death inches closer, but not yet. The darkness, however, has already begun swallowing the edges of Tony's world. Altogether, the Season 3 finale doesn't merely hint at the show's ending, it rehearses it. Every fracture, every betrayal, every moral contortion that later converges in that final cut to black is traced here with deliberate precision. Bobby Bacala didn't fall in love. He fell into a trap, and the real shock isn't who said it. It's who he ignored along the way. A curious revelation emerges on rewatch. Both Jojo Palmis and Janice Soprano set their sights on Bobby Bacala the moment tragedy left him widowed and emotionally adrift. Bobby, practically dissolving into his own grief and exhaustion, somehow bypassed the objectively dazzling Jojo, whose assets could have launched a small naval fleet, and instead chose Janice, a woman who often resembled a walking mortadella more than a romantic ideal. His decision suggests a man clinging to the nearest life raft, and Janice was nothing if not buoyant. The prevailing question remains: who used whom? Janice arrived armed with her only reliable weapon, an outsized sense of aesthetic entitlement paired with a talent for emotional stagecraft. To Bobby, this translated into Rubenesque allure, bolstered by those formidable warlocks she carried like secret artillery. Bobby, ever the bumbling White Castle-fueled caretaker, soon ascended from Junior's doting nursemaid to one of Tony's more prominent lieutenants, a transformation so unlikely that even Quasimodo could have predicted it. Of course, the entire Soprano clan operates as a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. They charm, they groom, and they deploy affection like bait. Bobby's downfall followed the usual pattern. A lonely, earnest man, overwhelmed by the intoxicating charisma of someone who recognized his emotional openness as both endearing and easily exploitable. Yes, Janice likely developed real affection. She tends to confuse emotional curiosity with devotion, but affection hardly cancels out opportunism. At her core, she remains a climber, and Bobby was a particularly convenient rung on the ladder. Yet none of this erases the enduring mystery. Jojo, with all her physical advantages, allegedly wanted the mortadella as well. It's a claim as believable as someone selling laser printers out of a Crown Victoria. All of this only highlights a lingering frustration. The series criminally underused Jojo, and, while we're naming names, Mikey too. Both characters had the rare quality of leaving viewers wishing for more. In a narrative world overflowing with larger-than-life personalities, it's remarkable that two relatively minor figures managed to cast such long shadows. Here's what no one admits about The Sopranos. Some of its biggest moments are embarrassingly bad. Every acclaimed series has its blemishes, but certain moments in The Sopranos manage to rise above mere imperfection and ascend to the realm of the unintentionally comedic, the baffling, or the outright sloppy. The Fat Dom fiasco. Fat Dom's death is often held up as an emblem of New York's contempt for Jersey. Unfortunately, The scene plays less like a calculated power move and more like a sweaty vaudeville routine. The audience is expected to believe that one of Phil Leotardo's supposed top guys decides the height of professional intimidation is strolling into a Jersey front business, reading the paper, insulting their murdered top earner to their faces, and behaving with the situational awareness of a man who wandered in by mistake. The entire sequence drags on with the humidity of a basement boiler room, complete with forced banter about $5 a pound and suspiciously convenient luggage. Christopher's selective moral enlightenment. Then comes the saga of Christopher's spiritual journey in Las Vegas. The implication that a character whose resume includes murder somehow earned a psychedelic cleansing because Tony slept with his girlfriend is one of the more generous leaps the show ever asked its viewers to tolerate. Evidently, self-growth requires the occasional homicide, especially when it's family. Arena's English lesson. Arena proudly offering up "thanks you very much" as evidence of her linguistic progress remains a curious detail. Displaying day one vocabulary as classroom triumph, despite being functionally fluent, is a choice, just not a flattering one. Paulie and the drawer of panties. Paulie's moment of olfactory curiosity in the bedroom remains a standout entry in the show's grand compendium of unnecessary grossness. Clean or not, the act lands exactly as intended: unsettling, inexplicable, and unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The burger stop with Christopher. The scene in the burger shop, where Christopher delivers yet another round of abrasive, racially tinged tirades, remains a perennial cringe point. The character's presence there is illogical. He's on the way to dinner, openly dislikes the clientele, and yet inexplicably insists on stopping. Yes, the entitlement is the point, the assumption that his reputation grants immunity wherever he wanders. Even so, the dialogue strains credibility, and the episode around it never quite earns the detour. The pizza parlor disrespect. The ongoing theme of casual disrespect finds another home in the pizza parlor incident, adding yet another notch in the series' tally of scenes that manage to be memorable without being especially good. Tony's assassination attempt. Few moments aimed for high-stakes tension and landed so squarely in unintentional parody as Tony's assassination attempt. The would-be killers, apparently moonlighting from a slapstick comedy, cannot manage to hit a stationary, 6 feet 1 inch target from a modest distance. The sequence is so poorly executed that it undermines its own dramatic importance. Even jokes about more capable assassins elsewhere feel almost compassionate in comparison. It easily ranks among the show's most sloppily crafted scenes, rivaled only by the under-the-bridge execution of the hitmen originally hired to eliminate Brainless the First. Melfi's spiritual interlude. Elsewhere, the much-discussed Melfi sex scene, complete with religious overtones, lingers longer than narrative necessity demands. It's earnest, it's symbolic, and it's also undeniably tedious. The Coco curb stomp and the domino effect. Finally, the infamous curb stomping of Coco stands as one of the show's most viscerally disturbing moments. The brutality alone is enough to make viewers recoil, but its narrative consequences carry even more weight. This single act of rage effectively propels the story into the final war that consumes both Phil and Tony and accelerates the show toward its abrupt conclusion. It's a glaring reminder that the final season's pacing owed more to behind-the-scenes limitations than to the organic buildup of 6 seasons worth of storytelling. Here's what no one admits about self-proclaimed masterminds. Their greatest weapon is never strategy, just delusion with good acoustics. The fantasy is simple enough. Parachute into the show, trigger a complete internal meltdown, and walk away without ever pulling a trigger. The method? A masterclass in manufactured paranoia. One would merely call each member of the crew, deliver a flawlessly impersonated recording of another teammate bad-mouthing them, and sit back as wounded egos erupt into instant warfare. No bullets required, just vocal mimicry and a talent for weaponizing insecurity. According to this grand strategy, the carnage would be swift, spectacular, and conveniently self-inflicted. The finale practically writes itself. The architect of chaos strolling onto a battlefield of bodies, shaking their head with theatrical disappointment before announcing with cinematic flair, "Guess I'm the boss now." The The imagination at work here rivals a filmmaker convinced their daydream qualifies for an Oscar. It's less strategic analysis and more a full-length feature produced by someone convinced they're the undiscovered heir to The Godfather. Cue the dramatic phone order, the ominous lines about blood being more expensive than gold, and the inevitable question of whether such creative energy might be better managed with the help of a prescription. Subscribe.